You remember when we started this particular unit, which is the research and academic skills? Yeah, in the first part, what we did was we basically looked at, doing your SWOT analysis, which I'd asked you to look at, and the other bit was to look at understanding, the personal development plan or a PDP planner. Were you able to do something on that side in terms of, a PDP plan, and were you able to complete your SWOT?
Yeah.
Right, because there were essentially three things. So apart from that, in order for you to do your SWOT, you had to basically do your skills audit. And when you did your skills audit, after the skills audit was done, then you were able to, maybe look at a SWOT analysis. And then after you did your SWOT, you knew your strengths and weaknesses. You have to kind of put that into something called, the personal development planner. So were you able to put together a SWOT, and did you manage to do some skills audit internally with your friends, family about your skills?
Yeah, I did everything, sir.
So in terms of, do you have something that you want to share in terms of what you've got? Have you put it onto some sort of a document that we can look at and then maybe develop this further?
I was at my uncle's house that day, and I'd done it on his laptop. He need to send it over.
Okay. No worries. No worries. So could you briefly, summarize in terms of what were the, maybe the key things that you were able to look at when you did your skills audit? What were the areas that you decided on for doing the skills audit?
Strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
My strengths were my communication skills. I'm always focused.
Okay. And in terms of your
weaknesses.
Weaknesses, yes.
I need to weaknesses. I'm not dedicated enough. I get lazy sometimes. Sometimes days when I work, I overwork, which causes unnecessary stress.
Okay.
What else was there?
So let me just quickly recap your strengths. What were your strengths that you were able to pick up? I've just unshaded the screen for a minute, but just looking at what were maybe the three key areas wherein we looked at your strengths.
My communication skills.
Sorry, your communication skills, okay?
Right. My dedication.
And
what else? I'm passionate.
Okay, that's fine. So basically, if you recall, we had discussed that in terms of your skills, when you do that, sometimes when you look at your skills, you look at them from two aspects. One is professional, and the other is personal. So things when you look at communication skills will be more so on the professional side, and when you look at being passionate, and when you look at your commitment, they are going to be skills which are primarily going to be classified as strength areas, but they are going to fall into the remit of personal, not professional but personal, remit. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So that is something that we need to look at. Okay, in terms of what were the threats or opportunities that you were able to look at?
I remember doing it, but it's not in my head right now.
Right, okay, that's fine, no problem. So this is something, the reason of asking you to do this at this stage, at level 3, is that something which you should be more or less aware of, keeping in mind that, at some stage, these are things which basically translate into your CV. And also to a certain extent, these things basically become a part and parcel of your, day-to-day life. So these are things that you're aware of from time to time. and something when you get into discussions or in communication, you are easily able to kind of bring out these, and sometimes it is easier for you to remember and talk about them, because as of now we only look at them as words. For example, when you say you're good in communication skills, but sometimes in the interview stages or when you have a discussion, they might be further broken down into things like, if you remember the communications unit that we did, that okay, when you say you're good at communication skills, which area of communication skills? Is it verbal communication? Is it non-verbal communication? So when I say verbal, non-verbal, could be written. In written, are you proficient with emails? Say for example, formal business letters, or those kind of things will have to be looked at. So the idea of going into that would be to assess your academic basically competence here. And the SWOT analysis, the more detail you do, the more helpful that is, because at some stage when you are able to look at it, what it allows you to do is look at all these areas from a point of view of understanding that okay, these are areas that I need to improve, these are some of the areas which I have skills and strength on, and I don't need to do anything on this. So you keep developing some of those areas actively and some of those areas passively, and that is where we basically look at this concept of looking at doing what you call the SWOT analysis. So let's start off with the bit on the next learning outcome, and we will look at understanding how research is primarily conducted. So I'm going to try and pull out one or two presentations before I just open this up in front of you, because here in this unit there is a lot to actually get on with. I will just give you a bit of a brief overview, but at the same point in time, what we need to be able to do is I'm going to try and send you one or two presentations for you to get some in-depth analysis about how and where do we do research, how do we do research, and the bits and pieces which are related to some of the tasks. So here we go. Later, try in an hour. So today's session, primarily we're looking at about 45 minutes just to pace you up, because there are bits and pieces to go through. But let's relate that to what the learning outcome 2 is asking us to do. So basically, in the first one, the whole essence is to look at understanding yourself, and your academic competence. The reason is at level 3, when you've just done your A levels and you're doing something over and above that, what the unit is intending to do is ask you to rate yourself, understand yourself, and classify your areas of strength, your weaknesses, what could be areas that you want to develop going further in terms of opportunities, and last but not least, what are the areas that you perceive as threat, which could be neutralized in terms of by picking up more qualification or more skills, which will at some stage make that kind of quadrant empty, but at the same point in time make your skills and your strength and weakness areas quite loaded, in the sense that there are lots of things that you can put into that. And then the idea was to primarily look at doing your skills audit. After that, you get your SWOT done, and then once you have your SWOT, your weakness areas and your threats. That is what you actually put together into a development plan. Now, I'll give you an idea in terms of a CPD or a development plan. Now, when we do this plan from a point of view of looking at, say, when you're working, it becomes a career professional development plan. And when you look at it from a point of view of personal development, that means you're looking at growing your skills and your areas in terms of knowledge, then you call it a PDP. But there is thin line differentiation between a PDP and a CPD, because CPD is more used as a term, commonly used term within offices or when you start to work. But when you look at maintaining that development plan on a personal basis, and it is not shared with somebody externally, then it is called a PDP. But when it is shared with your line manager or your department manager or somebody who's senior enough to you when you're working within the organization, that would become a CPD plan or a career professional development plan, because whatever training, whatever development you're doing, and you're identifying your strengths and weaknesses, your areas of opportunities and threat, you're actually working towards gaining some skills or doing a course or kind of improving that areas so that you are able to move further in your career. And that is why it is CPD. So this is an example that I want to show you how your plan should look like. So for example, this is a CPD which I've done wherein I'm an examiner. Say for example, for Pearson, I teach a lot of areas. The date, timing is important because you want to be able to put some timing down. Why you've done this qualification, how many hours you've done, what will I get of it, how did I make learning happen, and then where will I apply. So when we look at a PDP in terms of the template that I've sent to you, it's pretty similar to this. The only areas being that there'll be slight differentiation. Let's look at. So I look at the last one which I sent you as an email. So in terms of a CPD plan, probably pretty much the same template that I sent you, as you can see. Now this is what we see as a template, and this is what is a filled template looking like. But this is something which I've been able to do because I know what my areas of development are, and that have been identified by doing a SWOT. And before the SWOT, I've done something called a skills audit at my end to be able to understand what are the areas that I need to be competent in or gain skills in, so that equips me to perform my job or my job function effectively. Is that okay? So this is a format that I sent to you as an example, wherein you could look at doing a skills audit on the basis of your body language, your tone of voice, delivery, facial expressions, and the use of ICT in terms of your IT knowledge. But you could expand this into adding a lot of areas which you feel you need to check on, and then classify them as areas of your strengths. So they could be personal and professional, and this then can be related to the things that you get here in terms of scores. If it's good or you're at an expert level, it could be just poor, average, good, or outstanding, whichever scale you choose. But generally accepted scale, wherein you pick this up, you put it into your SWOT. So you might say that I'm very good at IT, or I'm very good with technology, and that is one of your strength areas, because given the work that you need to be able to do when you work in a business or in a company, and if you're given the use of softwares or IT related equipment, you're generally very good with that, and that would become an area of strength because you require very little supervision or very little help to be able to start running on it or starting to work on it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So basically, this is what I would suggest that you need to complete, and once you complete this at some stage will actually look at covering your task 1.1, and some of the targets that you set for improvement are kind of positioned in the PDP. And then how you achieve these targets, we are going to put the SMART targets, which is saying these targets are very specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're realistic, and those, when you put that in the PDP from that aspect, will basically say that that will help you achieve the merit side of things. I'm going to try and show you another, PDP just in case as a template, because there is no set specific format for this. But what we want to be able to do is look at something which allows you to, get this into some shape or form. So just having a quick look to show you something which I can, this is a good example. Which is a pre-filled template, and I can send this off to you. Now, what I want to be able to do is, this is a level 5. Because you're doing a level 3 course, I just want to show it to you from a point of view of understanding, but I'll send you maybe another example that is something which is going to be appropriate for your level, which is level 3. And this is very important because when you study further at level 4, level 5, even to a certain extent level 6, up to your bachelor's degree, you will always be asked to do a PDP, and this is something fundamentally that you have to understand how you draw this up, how you update this, and why is this such an important document. Okay, so it gives a bit of a background in terms of why the personal plan is being put together. So here, the Chartered Marketing Institute is a very well-known body. So obviously use the template which they have provided on the website. This is something which you can Google up, and I can send it to you as well. It's something which I've downloaded from the open space on the internet. They have given an example that okay, there is somebody who's who's an individual who's got a background in terms of mobile telecommunication. He also works in the Territorial Army, and then he's been encouraged to basically enter into a training, to basically get into the next position, which is the platoon commander. And what he's done is he's then started off by putting together a PDP in terms of why this is important and how this will be required for it to be done. So if you see, he's filled up his strength areas. He started from a SWOT. He's put in weakness areas. Instead of weakness, he's called it the areas of further development. Slightly enlarge it so it's visibly clear. And then he's put down some opportunities and put down some threat. So one of his threats is he's not looking at putting personal threats in, but he's kind of, veered into the area wherein he said, okay, I would want to balance work and personal commitments. Because of technology today, what is tending to happen is that the thin line differentiation between personal and professional life is disappearing because we have access to emails and all those things. So your work never stops. And I think from that aspect, what he wants to do is have that balance is what he wants to achieve. And then he's used SMART target, as a way to kind of set some goals for him. So what do I need to learn? What do I have to do? What supports resources I need? How will I measure success? And what's the review date? So the same format of the CPD, as you see, has actually come in, and he's filled that up, who's going to be reviewing it. And then he's put some personal objectives as well. Then he's classified them into short-term, medium goals, and long-term. So short-term is 12 months, medium is 2 to 3 years, and long-term is 3 years. And then once he's done this, because this is a personal development plan, and he's looking at reaching the next position from being next position is the platoon commander or a second lieutenant. This thing is going to be signed off by his line manager, and there'll be some comments that they will put in, and then again it will be signed off by the CEO, commanding officer. Is that okay? So when you prepare this document, it will kind of look, what we are doing is we are doing this as a document at level 3 in 3 parts. So first things first, you're learning to basically do a skills audit to get your areas of strength and weakness. Once you've got that, you put together that into some sort of a SWOT. And then once you put that into a SWOT, you then individually pick out all the major goals and create what is called the SMART targets and put it into a PDP plan. Is that okay? So I'll send this to you, but I'll send you a toned down version of this, which is going to be more appropriate for level 3. Now, having covered that, what we want to do now is basically look at understanding from an academic standpoint of view, how do you do research? How do you find out whether this information is coming from the source? Is this something which is published, secondary information, or is this something which is coming out from a third-party reference? So here in Learning Outcome 2, what we want to be able to do is understand how research is done. What are the types of research, primary, secondary, and there is something called tertiary. And then what are the ways in which we can actually conduct these research, whether it's primary or secondary. And then in Learning Outcome 4, we should be able to create a research proposal. If I say you want to research about a simple thing which is looking at your further education. So for example, you want to join an appropriate degree. So what you will do is you'll do a bit of research to try and find out which will be the best, bachelor's degree that I should join, keeping in mind my skill set, my strength areas, the previous qualification that you have, and then what in future will it help me to achieve when I complete the degree. So that research that you get into, which is browsing the internet, maybe going to an open day, are things that you're looking at doing, finding more information about. And the reason why you want to find more information about is because you want to know whether this is going to be something which you are interested in doing, this is something which you'll find it valuable in the future, and to a certain extent, will it help you get a job or get into employment. So that is basically looking at learning outcome 4. Now, there are other pieces that will, look at extending learning outcome 1 into learning outcome 6, wherein we want to reflect, and that process is primarily called review. So once you've done a PDP, how do you review your PDP or your personal development plan? So you've had a plan for 6 months. What is the importance of review, and how do you do the review after 6 months, after 12 months, because it's a working document, and that is what we'll get to see in learning outcome 5, learning outcome 6 essentially. So I'm going to minimize this for now, and then there are lots of basic reading which I would suggest that you need to look at in this particular unit. And what I've done is basically just the research bit I have kind of drafted into 3 or 4 different learning outcomes, because the unit actually corresponds to understanding academic research and academic writing and research. What we want to be able to do is understand this whole topic, which is going to be also important, because when you look at studying further, you will be having a mandatory module to do research on. That means you have to identify an area of research or an area of problem or area of interest that you need to kind of do a bit of research, which is either a desk-based research or basically finding information about it. So what I want to do is, there are a few slides that I'll go through from different presentations, but I'm going to send these off to you and also upload on Moodle, so that you have to go through them to get the full picture in terms of understanding. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at understanding to a certain extent with the context of research. Now, I know it's a very open term, but when we look at saying that I want to do a bit of research, we are going to do it in the context of something called marketing research. The reason I say this is that it will be easy for us to relate what it means and why we are looking at doing this. Now, when you look at the definition of the word research, it basically talks about you're going to do some systematic investigation into, either in terms of study of a particular material or, a fact, or maybe a occurrence of an event. And the idea would be, towards the end of your research or the end of your study, essentially, you're looking at coming out with some sort of a conclusion that, I've spoken to 10 people and this is what their opinion is, and then you come out with a conclusion. A simple example would be, sometimes when you go to some malls and you're shopping outside in a big mall, you do see that there are a lot of people which tend to try and approach you because they're doing some sort of a research. They ask you to fill up a survey or a form, and the idea of they doing this is because they're trying to understand maybe the buying habits, how many times you visit that particular location, or what you tend to buy, how much do you spend. And the idea of understanding all that is they want to kind of tailor services so that it is meeting the expectation of the customer every time you come into the mall. So the context that we will look at studying research will be related to the fact that it is understanding marketing research. Now, there are lots of things that we look at, and this is some other background, but I'm just going to look at, if we do research, and research is nothing but a systematic study of certain topics, events, or occurrences, then in that case, what you're trying to do is, you're trying to basically look at understanding why this is done, how this is done, when this is done, and where is it done. And that is what we want to understand from a point of view of academic research. So research will be nothing but a systematic activity to try and understand maybe identification. When I say it is to understand why this event is happening or this problem is occurring. Sometimes you look at a basic example. If you drive a car and you're facing some problems with it, what you do is you start the process of diagnosis, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason why you want to look at the diagnosis, you might switch off the car and it's not switching on properly, so it's showing as you're hearing a cranking noise. You switch it off and then try and put the ignition again. Now the idea, what you're doing is you're actually doing some sort of a background check to see why this problem is happening. You're trying to diagnose why this problem is happening. So it starts off with an activity or a basic activity of identification of a problem or an issue. And that identification of problem or an issue you want to solve, you are looking at collecting some data about it. That means you would say that, okay, I drove the car last night, it was perfectly fine, what's happened overnight? So maybe you try and do a bit of investigation, you go around the car and you see, okay, did you leave any lights on? Because the car isn't starting up, the battery's maybe gone dead. So you do a bit of investigation, and the idea is to collect some facts or figures or some data to find out why this problem is occurring. And once you've collected that, you try and analyze and put 2 plus 2 together to say, oh, I think I left the inner light on and that has drained out the battery, and that's the reason the car is not starting. So you've done a bit of analysis after, discovering the problem, and that discovery of the problem basically has led you to, come to some sort of a conclusion after finding out that, okay, this is the reason why the battery has drained out, and that's the reason the car is not starting. And then you're basically going to use that information to maybe call AA or maybe the local garage or something like that to be able to get that new battery put in, or to ask the expert, which is maybe a mechanic or somebody, to confirm the opinion that this is what has exactly gone wrong with the car. Correct?
Correct.
Would you go with the same sequence of events more or less?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then once the sequence of events have been confirmed, which you have discovered, or you've done a bit of analysis or study on, and it is confirmed by the car mechanic, then in that case what you do is you then try to identify what could be the probable solutions for it. One could be, he would say that, okay, I can take out the battery, or I can jump start the car because the battery is really new, and he brings the wires across, connects it to the other car, and then jump starts your battery or the car to give it a bit of a shock, and then it boosts the signal, and maybe the car starts, and he says, okay, if you can keep it running for a couple of hours, maybe drive it around, it should recharge the battery. The other option could be that he gives a solution that, okay, the battery is more or less towards the end of life because it's 4, 5, 6 years old. Best would be to replace the battery so that you don't have a problem because it won't charge fully. So you're looking at probable solutions which could then be used to kind of solve that problem. Correct?
Right.
Now, so here the whole process of this, study or this undertaking that you do has been done because of the fact that your car did not maybe start in the morning, isn't it? So that was maybe the problem, and from the problem you've gone to the extent of finding a solution. And this has happened using the activity called research, or maybe some sort of an investigative study to get to the bottom of it, why this problem had occurred. Okay?
Yeah.
So this gives you a clear idea in terms of, okay, why do we look at doing a bit of research, and this research is then primarily done to get to the problem. Okay? Now there are 2 ways that I could look at this research or the investigative study that I've done, a bit of investigation that I've done. One is, assuming you had 2 cars, you obviously took your car and you went to the office in the morning, but the wife's car had a problem with this particular thing, and she then, after finding out that she could probably get the car going and all that, she gives you a ring and you're in the office. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, if you get a ring in the office, then you tend to ask a bit of questions, because understanding that maybe your partner or your wife is not that savvy with the mechanics of the car, but you ask a few set of investigative questions saying that, have you tried doing this? Have you done that? Or did you switch off the lights and try doing it? Did you press on this? So you give her some instructions and guidance to see if this could resolve or solve the problem. But because you're hearing this whole problem or the occurrence of this whole problem coming across from your wife or your partner, you are getting it not first hand, but you're getting it second hand. Would you agree?
Yeah, of course.
So if you had this problem with your car and you were present at that point in time and then did this resolution and whole process, that means you were there, and this is what is called primary research, because you're experiencing it firsthand. You're doing it firsthand. You're getting the information directly from the source, or you're diagnosing the problem and then going through it as yourself. But in the case of the other situation where your wife is speaking to you over the phone, you are getting this information relayed to you from another person. So you are not at that location, and because you're asking questions remotely and somebody else is looking at it and then passing or relaying the information on to you, you get this information from the secondary source. Correct?
Right, correct.
So in a way, this would then classify as something called secondary research. That means you're giving a bit of guidance on the phone and somebody's carrying out the instructions, coming back to you with feedback. But because you're not present at that location, you are not primary to that problem. You are a secondary person to that problem. So in a way, similarly, sometimes when you get information which comes to you, from the source, but not directly, but you're getting it from somebody in the middle, then that would be called secondary research. A simple example that I would give you is sometime, every evening you open the TV and obviously sit down in front of the TV and hear the news, correct?
Yes.
So if there's an incident which has happened, like I think if I recall yesterday, there was a news of a plane crash in Kathmandu somewhere, and a number of people have lost their lives. A tragic incident, unfortunately, but that information is coming to you on the news. Because you are not present at that location and you are not the first person to witness it, you are getting this information as secondary information coming across or you're getting this information from the BBC News. So that information coming to you when the event has happened and you are not at that place and you get it through a medium of communication in the middle, that information to you is secondary.
Right.
Okay? And if you were present there or maybe in that location when the crash happened or at the airport and you witnessed this firsthand, then the information that you put out, maybe call your family or maybe your friends and relatives or whatever, then you are the primary source for that information because you're seeing it happening in front of your eyes or you've witnessed it, more or less in front of you. Okay?
Yeah.
So this bit is clear, primary and secondary?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good stuff. Now, there are lots of things that we look at when we look at, the research in particular, and I'm going to just skip through some of the slides to come to that part, which is looking at, so this one I will send you for your reading, and go to the learning outcome 2. So, yeah, let's look at this. Now here, let's focus on something which is called, how do you identify the problem, right? And when you look at the identification of the problem, that helps you identify whether that research is primary, secondary, some of the other terms that we will introduce is, related to qualitative or quantitative, and that is what we want to understand. Now, when you look at, if you see this particular slide, what it is looking at is the process of identification of problem or problem definition process, as we call it. Now here, what you are doing is the reason why you've taken this investigative study or this study to understand why the problem is occurring is the research, because the problem is you're facing an issue, you're facing a problem. Now, when you look at that, what you tend to do is, in order to diagnose the problem or why the occurrence of this problem is happening, you do a couple of things. One is you can look at doing a discussion with the decision maker. Like in the case of the car, which I gave you an example of. Now, if you're present in that situation directly, you are basically going through some of the steps to understand why this problem is occurring. But assuming in the case of your wife's car or your spouse's car, because you're not at that location, what you're trying to do is relay and get that information from somebody, and you're basically having a discussion. Now, sometimes this discussion is in the form of interviews. Sometimes this discussion is in the form of investigative questions. So sometimes when you speak to your say that, can you check this out? Can you check that? And can you see if this is there, if this is switching on, if the lights are switching on, just to diagnose if the battery is running and is it battery not died and things like that. What you're doing is you're asking a lot of questions, and because they are being asked over the phone, sometimes they can be classified as interview, in the sense you're asking somebody to check and then reply to you. Now, in the case of this data which is collected, sometimes when you collect this data, what tends to happen is you try and put a lot of reasoning behind this data to find out why is this problem occurred in the first instance. And when you look at putting this approach of putting a logic behind to find out why this has occurred, that particular process is called the problem definition process, because what you're trying to do is put some facts, figures, relevant data behind it to find out why this problem has occurred. So you want to pinpoint why this problem has occurred. And once you know that this problem has occurred and these are the reasons because of which the problem has occurred, then and only then can you go into finding a solution. Is that okay?
Right.
And
Yeah.
to a certain extent, this all is involved in primary and secondary research. So in primary research, because you're present or you're getting the information from the source directly, you will ask questions, maybe do surveys, or take a questionnaire out and collect the data. And in the case of secondary, when you're not getting the information directly from the source, you are going to be relying on published information, article, news, or other places like the websites, wherein you're trying to gather information for understanding the problem, why it has occurred. And in those cases, that tends to be secondary research. Now, once you get all that put together, what you want to do is you want to create a hypothesis. To understand this 5 or 6 step process, first step is you start with introduction, which is basically talking about the problem, the rationale, why it has occurred and all that. Once you know the problem has occurred, then you get into what, why, where, when. And that part would be collecting a lot of information about the process itself in terms of the problem. And that bit is essentially called review. If you are doing an academic piece in terms of review, you're calling it a literature review. That means you want to find out the factors of what, why, when, where, and that could mean that you're referring to the manual of the car. You might want to take it to the mechanic or the dealership to get the problem diagnosed. The third set would be to try and put all this together into some sort of a reasonable logic that why this problem occurred. And that putting together of the reasonable logic of why this problem occurred was when we discussed the example of maybe one of the lights was accidentally left switched on, and that kind of drained the battery. So what you've done is you put together some sort of a logic or a rationale which basically tells you that this is one of the reasons why the battery drained out. And this part, which is the third part, is called the hypothesis. Okay, when you're trying to kind of formulate a reason to and the facts and figures behind to support the reason why this problem occurred. Now, once you know that this hypothesis or the reason or rationale behind why this problem occurred, what you do is you try and do some findings to correct the problem and do some analysis to correct this problem. And those findings would then pinpoint you to actually taking corrective measures to solve that problem. That could mean if the car is not starting at all, then you're more or less certain you have to take it to the dealership, call the AA or green flag, and your car is towed to the nearest dealership. The mechanic diagnoses the same set of problem what you've gone through. He goes through a similar set of processes, and then he comes out with a finding. Okay, this is what has happened, and probably you're right. This is the solution. And then last step is you try and draw a conclusion. So in this case, the last step would be tries to replace the battery or basically replaces the battery to make the car up and running. And this part is primarily in the research process called the conclusion and recommendation part. Okay. So there are 5 steps to the research process, and it starts off with background information, introduction, goes to some sort of a review, which is literature review, then comes to some sort of a methodology of arriving at why this problem occurred, how did it occur, and what it could resolve, what are the steps that will resolve that problem. Then you go to findings to try and implement them to correct the problem, and then towards the end you make a conclusion recommendation. The next time when you for example, switch off the car and walk in, you're going to doubly make sure that the lights are switched off before you walk into your house, something like that. And that would be conclusions and recommendation. Is that okay? Right. And in this bit, in this whole process of research or the investigative study, whatever you call it, the study, investigative study, research, what you do is you classify data into 2 types. You're getting it from the source, which is primary. You're getting it through a source, and that is relaying that to you, or you're getting the information from a source which has seen it firsthand and you're getting it at second hand, or second in the second version, then that is called secondary. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So simple definitions at this moment, just to understand how you classify information coming to you, and basically related to that. So I will close this, not to confuse you and take you into detail. We'll just look at maybe picking out one or two slides which might be, yeah. So this is the third bit, which is fieldwork. I don't think you need that as well. And then this is the last bit, which is looking at conclusions or recommendation. So the bit here, which I think you don't, maybe not need this also. I'll close that. Now, what we need to do, once you have this overall understanding of what is research, how it is done, type of research, primary, secondary, we need to be able to know how and what are the methods to collect information for primary research, and how do we collect information for secondary research. Okay, and that is what we will go into when we look at this particular presentation, which is relevant to your learning outcome 2. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so research, we've done the definition of research, talked about systematic collection, analysis, interpretation of data to answer a particular question or solve a particular problem. You clear with that?
Yeah.
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 Now, this bit is the process through which we look at, and this I'm going to do a full slide so you understand this. This is where we start off the research. So what is the selection of an area? You're going back to the example of the car problem.
Right.
So selection of the area is basically talking about, the problem area. Okay. From the problem area, you go to understanding what is the problem. I know the car is not starting up, but that's a big problem. But within that problem area, what is the issue, or what is the main issue wherein the car, why is the car not starting? That is where you select or narrow down onto a particular problem.
Right.
Then you're going down to understanding the crude reason the car isn't starting up. Maybe when you try and put the ignition on, the ignition itself is not coming. So the main problem is maybe the battery is not even charging, or giving the charge. From there you look at collecting a little bit of evidence, which is what I called, it was literature review or review of the problem, that why is this happening. You look at some answers, you try and find some solutions yourself to come to a conclusion that if the car would have started, no problem, there's no need to do any research. But if there was a problem and you arrived at a solution, or you kind of rightly pinpointed the problem that the battery is dead, because the battery is discharged, then in that case you would have done some review to cross question and see what was wrong, is the light coming on, what happened, recollect a few sequence of events, and from there what you did was you refined that problem to see where exactly is the problem. Is it just the ignition? If the battery charge is happening, sometimes you hear a cranking noise, but the charge is not happening, or the engine is not starting, then it could be a problem in the spark plug. So you take that process of finding out until you come to a resolution that it is this particular thing which has caused the problem. And then what you do is you basically look at some issues, whether you can resolve it yourself or you have to take it to a dealership. Can you jumpstart it with the second car in the house using the cords? If not, then you end up calling, the garage in, UAE or whatever, and then you put together a plan that, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Call them up. Okay, we'll be there in half an hour. They'll pick up the car, take it to the dealership. Somebody else will look at it, confirm the problem. Once the problem is confirmed, what they then tend to do is give you a solution. Okay, so in a way, this is how the whole process essentially works. But because we are looking at it from a standpoint view of academic research, we need to familiarize ourselves with 5 different terms. So, your introduction basically consists of this particular area. And if I just highlight that to you briefly. So our introduction consists of this particular area. Okay. Then second is followed by literature review. Third, what we do is we formulate some sort of a hypothesis that this is why the problem has happened. Once we know the problem, what we try and do is then diagnose the problem by collecting data. And once the problem is known, what we have done is we've collected some findings. And once we know the findings, what we do is we put together a plan to basically, solve that problem. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now let's look at next slide. So here, this is maybe a more, kind of a description of how you would look at this in an academic sense. So sometimes what we do is we do something, you study something from a qualitative point of view. Qualitative is descriptive. And sometimes you study things from a point of view of numbers, facts, figures, and that is analytical or quantitative. Okay? These are two types of research which we can do, two ways in which we can do research: descriptive / analytical. So descriptive tends to be qualitative, that means you're focusing on qualitative parameters, and analytical tends to be fact, figures, numbers, and you're doing it from a quantitative or numbers point of view. And this is obviously a flowchart just defines that. We look at the 5 elements that I've basically spoken about, and then this is not important, but I'm going to skip to the slide. This is journal reference that you have to go through, but just going back to where the outcome for us is important and why do we do research is we are going to that particular bit. So I'm going to do this collection of data, research tools. Okay. Now, sometimes when you get into a study and we're trying to study what is happening, how do you think you can collect information? What are the ways? If I ask you to say, for example, if I ask you to go to a particular shop and collect some information regarding how many customers come into the shop, what are they buying, what is the average value of the shop basket, that in terms of what is shopping they do, whether it's male, female, how would you go and collect this data?
A book or a magazine.
Come again, sorry, Qasim, on that.
A book or a magazine.
Right. So basically, what you will do is you'll collect the data by. Sometimes when you go into a retail store, you see people at the door. They have a ticker in the hand. The reason they use that ticker is they want to count how many people are actually going into the store. Correct? They want to count the footfall happening into the store. So essentially, if you have to gather this data, what you're looking at is you're looking at recording some part of this information, which will allow you to capture, whatever data you're trying to get. So sometimes in the shop, when you're looking at, you will see that a lot of people are walking in and they are collecting data, which is in terms of number of walk-ins happening to the shop. Then there will be somebody at the till or maybe somebody behind the counter who will be making a lot of observations to see what is the average size of the basket. That means the average money the customer is actually spending. And in some cases, when you see somebody in doubt, you will also ask them a few questions, or they might come back and ask you a few questions about a particular product, and you might want to give them some guidance to say, okay, this is this, this is that, and then they make up the mind to buy. Then that would mean that you're basically getting or engaging into some sort of an exercise of questioning and answering session, right? And at some stage, what will happen is if you are a person responsible for sales, when this question and answering session is happening, you are also all the time measuring up to see if the customer's interest is there. Is he going to buy? Is she going to pick this up, or is she going to go to something else to pick up? What you're doing in that process is, as a salesperson, trying to measure up the activities which the person is trying to do or the questions the person is trying to ask. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and all that is being done because you want to, at the end of the day, make sure that the sales of that particular product or whatever you are selling happens and the customer ends up buying it. Right?
Yeah.
So this particular activity which keeps happening, and you ask sometimes, certain types of questions. It could be yes and no questions. It could be open-ended questions. Now these questions that you're asking, is something that in some cases could be to go as per a particular pattern that you have in the background to try and lead the customer to a particular, situation. Correct?
Correct.
So in that case, what we look at is we are trying to ask, sometimes there are questions which are just, what do you call, questions which are used to strike a conversation, right?
Yes.
So strike a conversation would be that you want to get more information from the customer and you ask them questions which are open-ended. So I know that you're looking at buying a television, but could you tell me what are the reasons why you want to look at a particular model, or what size of television you want in terms of the screen size? And this is an open-ended question because you want the customer to get talking, and in return you want to get hold of some good pieces of information from that conversation which will help them and help you make a decision, right?
Right, of course, yeah.
So, and sometimes you say, are you interested in do you want screen size? Sometimes you ask them a direct question. Are you looking at screen sizes 40 inch or greater than 40 inch? And this is only two choices, or you want a smaller one or you want a larger one. But sometimes you ask them a question that, do you have a particular, screen size in mind? And then that is an open-ended question. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes what happens is when you are working within, say, a sales side of things, what tends to happen is you go by a particular script or you go by a particular pattern. And the idea is you are asking questions which are leading to the next question, leading to the next question, and it is at the end of the day leading to a particular decision-making model. So sometimes when you ask questions to break the problem down into a smaller problem, then you are looking at essentially kind of, let's put it this way, deconstructing the problem. If there's a big problem, sometimes you ask questions around it so that you are able to understand what are the various reasons why this problem occurred. And what you're trying to do is deconstruct that. And here, the idea is you're asking very unstructured questions which are related to the problem, but not directly, but indirectly related to the problem. And sometimes what you'll do is you'll ask questions which are related to, the problem directly, but it is in a stepwise fashion. That means a simple example of that would be, I will ask you, okay, could you introduce yourself? And you will say, my name is, Aman Qasim. How old are you? I'm say 18 or 19 years old. So what do you do currently? Next question could be, are you studying or are you working? So what is happening is you see this in a sequence, one after the other. And the idea is to try and profile the customer. What is your age group? What is your background? What qualification you have? Are you working or not working? So we are going by a set pattern. And this is more or less a structured form of questioning because I want to get to know you better. But I can also do this same type of questioning by following an unstructured pattern. Depending on, you might come into the store and, you would say, okay, you're browsing around, then you call somebody to get some help. And what you would do is say, okay, you might come in and you say, okay, are you okay? I say, I'm fine, and I'm Aman, how can I help you? And then you start off from answering one or two basic questions, like, okay, what are you looking at? Okay, I can point you in the right direction. Maybe that's the aisle that you need to go to. And at some stage, when you go there, and then you start this line of questioning, why are you looking at buying? Are you replacing? Are you buying a new one? Are you buying a new TV? Or is it an add-on TV to your other room? And you get into those questioning patterns. Correct?
Correct.
So that could be when the customer has led you, but once you had a bit of interaction, you've gone into from the semi-structured, you've gone into a structured route to get into the sales. Right? So that format is basically how you gather information, sometimes directly from the source, and this is the route of gaining information or getting information from the primary source. It is called primary research, and here you conduct interviews, you use questionnaires, surveys to get the information firsthand from the user, and this can be done in structured way, unstructured way, semi-structured way. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
okay. Now I don't want to get into anything beyond this at this moment, and I'll stop probably here, going back to what we are looking at. So in the first process of the learning outcome, what we want to be able to do is understand how you carry out primary research, right? So when we look at slides 11 to slides 27 or 28, we are looking at studying various ways in which we can collect data firsthand, which is nothing but primary research. Is that okay?
Right, yeah.
And then when we sometimes collect information from secondary source, that means it is not coming to you directly. What we are looking at doing is we are collecting that data or that information on a rebound or through a source which is relaying that information to us, and that would be called secondary information. Okay?
Right.
Now what we want to be able to do is, using an exercise, identify, let me show you something. Identify, if I ask you to do, one second, primary, and I'll try and see if I can get that presentation. I want you to kind of look at whether this is primary or this is secondary. And I'll ask you these questions. Give me 1 second. So that in terms of definition, I want to be clear that you have understood whether this is primary data or this is secondary data. That is what I want to understand.
Right.
Just give me 1 second. Let me see if I can bring that out. There you go. Let me share my screen. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few slides, and you need to tell me whether this is primary, secondary, or tertiary source of data. Okay? So if you look at this, what do you see on this slide?
CSC.
What do you see on the slide?
I see mountain. I see clock.
Yes. So when you talk about time, and when you look at time, is this primary data or secondary data?
Primary.
Primary.
Primary, yeah, because you see it.
Primary. The key part of the question is when you look at time. So when you are looking at time or your watch directly, you are looking at time, finding out time directly, and that is primary data. But if you are in the same room and you ask somebody to tell you, okay, you're lying on the bed, or maybe you're facing, your back facing towards the watch or the wall clock on the wall, what you are going to then ask somebody to do in the room is, can you tell me what the time is? And when you get that information, will that be primary or secondary?
Secondary, of course.
Correct. Now, so when we look at time, this is primary. Now, when you look at this as a novel or as a autobiography of Anne Frank, is this primary or is this secondary?
It's primary.
Okay. You're reading about somebody's biography. Is it primary or is it secondary?
Secondary.
Reading about it. Secondary. The reason is because somebody has spoken to her and then captured that information, and once that's been captured, it's been published in the form of book, and the person who captured it was primary, and because you're reading the book, you're not speaking to her directly, you're reading the book, that is why you're getting this information as secondary.
Oh, I thought that Anne Frank book was she written herself. That's what I was
Oh,
talking
this is a biography which somebody would have written. You don't write your biography yourself. Somebody else would write it, isn't it?
Yes, it's a secondary.
If somebody else writes your biography, then the person who's writing the book and you're narrating to somebody, then that person is getting it firsthand, and that is primary source. But when you buy that book off the shelf, and it's an autobiography or a biography of a person, because you're getting it in the printed and published form, that means somebody must have had access to it before, which was primary, and because we are getting it as a published book, it is
Secondary.
secondary. Okay. The next one. Assuming this is a small paper advertisement that you're reading, is this primary or is this secondary?
This one will be primary.
Yes, because somebody has placed an advert and you picked up the newspaper and you're reading it firsthand, right? So this is primary. Now, this is maybe again a very example of a very old advertisement. Almanac of 1875, which was published by Boston Daily Advertiser. So somebody has advertised it, published it. Is this primary or secondary?
Secondary.
It is not secondary. It is primary because the person who created the advert is primary. But when you get it or see it on a hoarding or on a billboard, you are looking at it as a tertiary user, because what would have happened is the person who printed this in the warehouse or in the printing press had this information firsthand. The person who put it up on the billboard had it as secondary, because when he would have opened the billboard up and put it across on the billboard as a poster or as a banner, that person would have seen it the first time or second time, and for him it will be secondary. But when you are driving around in your car or you're passing by that road or you're walking past it, then you're seeing it as the third person. So it will be either primary or tertiary. If you're creating the advertisement yourself or this billboard yourself, then you are primary to it. But if somebody else sees it while you're passing through, then it is tertiary.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at this book. This is not a biography, but this is a book. Will this be primary or secondary or tertiary?
Primary, because
primary.
Yeah,
that's fine, because this is not an autobiography. You see a graph which is published on a website, say a stock market, Japanese stock market chart, which is on a website. Primary or secondary?
That would be primary, of course.
Primary, okay. This is a book which talks about the history of television. Primary, secondary, or tertiary?
The history of television, secondary.
Secondary, yeah. So you're getting the hang of it. What you're trying to do is you're looking at the source of information, and my idea of showing you this is, when you're looking at the source of information, you're trying to understand whether this source is primary, secondary, or tertiary. Tertiary would mean that this source has been printed, is a very old source. That means it's a very old advert, people have seen it, it's been reprinted, it's been put up again. That is why it is also tertiary. So when we talked about that hoarding of Boston Advertiser, it could also be tertiaries, because that would have been published and printed and seen in 1875, but maybe because it's been revived and it's been reprinted now, that means it's the second time round that you're seeing it. That is why that source could be tertiary. It could have been that you don't see it on the hoarding outside or the billboard outside, you see it on the internet, and that could be tertiary. When it was originally published, primary. When it was put up on the billboard, secondary. And as a source, you're seeing it on the website, it is tertiary. Okay?
Of course.
Now this is a website. What is it? Primary or secondary or tertiary? Which talks about news reviews or film reviews?
A secondary.
Okay, very good. So you've got the hang of it. Newspapers, when you see publishing the news, it could be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Primarily secondary, because if you're picking up the newspaper for the current date, it is primary. If you're picking up a newspaper which is 2 days old, a day old, 2 days old, secondary or tertiary.
Yeah. So,
right?
Yeah.
If somebody's already had a look at that newspaper and then you pick it up from him for reading an article, tertiary. Okay?
Right.
What about magazines? It could be primary if you're buying it when it's a new issue, but if the issue is a monthly issue and you buy it sometime during the course of the month, so if you buy it when it's published and it's just on the stands, it could be primary. But if you buy it a week later, 2 weeks later, it could then become secondary. But it's still a current issue for January. The February issue has not come out, so it is a secondary thing. But if it was something that you picked up on the first day or in the first week, or when it was brought out into the stand, it would be primary. Correct?
Right.
just a small note, by American Airlines or something like that, which says, first I would like to introduce myself. I'm Elvis Presley and admire you and, blah, 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 and have great respect for you.
Primary.
This is a note which is written by Elvis Presley.
Or Elvis Presley would be secondary.
Okay.
Terry.
It could be primary if a person is giving you an autograph and you're receiving it in person, it is primary, right?
That's what I meant.
Okay, good stuff. So now you have an idea in terms of how to look at resources. So how do you classify them as primary? How do you classify them as secondary? Okay.
Right.
This is the key bit that we want to look at when we want to talk about understanding how do we look at carrying out primary and secondary research. How do we identify sources, whether it's in primary information or secondary information. Okay. And then we looked at a few examples to understand why in this example this is primary or why is this example secondary. Clear enough?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the session for here today, and I'm going to send you these two presentations for you to understand why it is primary, why it is secondary, and why is it tertiary as a resource. And then I'm going to send you this particular slide. Now, this is a bit more detailed than you need, but I would suggest that if you look at slides, 2 onwards till slide, I would say, primarily, I would say, go up to, slide 34, right? That would give you some good idea in terms of how do we carry out primary research, what are the process of doing primary research, and to a certain extent, secondary research. Okay. And next week when we do the session, the idea would be we will try and cover learning outcome, 4, which is related to learning outcome 2, and then learning outcome 6, which is related to your PDP SWOT and your skills audit. Okay. So it is imperative that you send me on the email your SWOT analysis, your skills audit that you've done. If you've done it on paper, you can take a photograph of it and email it to me so that at least it's like a scan that I have. And what we'll do is we'll briefly discuss that in correlation to how do we do a review of the PDP, how do we look at reviewing a SWOT, because this is like a working document. You do your SWOT today, maybe a year down the line when you've completed this course and you're in your first year of your uni, you will again do a SWOT because your strengths and weaknesses would have changed. So we look at the learning outcome 6 to do a review. Okay?
Right.
Any questions on this so far?
Not so far, sir.
Okay, good stuff. So I will try and send you your summative feedback today before close of play. And then what we will do is, catch up next week. I'm going to send out some invites because I know the invites have run out, but I will send out some invites for the next 2 weeks to be able to try and close this unit. So one for the 20th and one for 27th.
Great.
Just before the Easter break. So that you have then the Easter break to complete the other 2 units for certification in April.
Great.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
No worries. And I will send you a copy of this presentation and a handout for you to read just after the session in a couple of minutes.
Right, that's great, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot.